Good evening, everyone. I'm Reverend Craig Tuck, the pastor here at State Street United Methodist Church. For the handful of folks who are with us this evening in the sanctuary, for those who are with us online, thank you for choosing to be with us tonight. Tonight we will have one of the next, our first study looking at Henry Nouwen's book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. Before I share with you a little bit about the study and how we're going to do this evening, I want to share with you just a couple of announcements to keep you aware of. One is I hope you will join us Sunday mornings at 10 a.m. for worship. If you're a visitor or here with us for the first time, to let you know, too, a couple of events that are forthcoming here at State Street. Now, I do want to begin with a little bit of a disappointed announcement that this Sunday, we had planned to take a hiking trip at Mammoth Cave National Park. It looks like the weather is not going to be at all favorable for that. So we are going to go ahead and reschedule that for March the 14th. Yet, what I do want to invite you to is on March the 7th, here at the church from 4:30 to 6:30, we're going to invite back some food trucks again. I'll send information about that tomorrow, but Ladybug Fritters and Fries will join us here in the church parking lot, the back parking lot, from 4:30 to 6. We will social distance just like we have in the past. Bring a chair with you, and it'll be a wonderful time for us to fellowship. The following Sunday, we will have our hiking trip at Mammoth Cave National Park, and then on the 21st of March, we have together what's called Fear Busters for our children. So be sure you are checking your emails over the next week or so that you can find the ways for which we're doing everything we can to come together. We know that fellowship time together is crucially important for us, and we're trying to find all the wonderful and safe ways that we can do that. So we hope we'll see you at those locations and those times. Tonight we are going to focus on the book and the prologue and the introduction to Henry Nouwen's book called The Return of the Prodigal Son. If you were with us last month online for our study, we listened to a number of his sermons talking about and what it meant to be the beloved of God. And so I think you might hear some of the similar themes during this study. This study focuses on home and a homecoming with God, and it uses the prodigal son story in the Bible, the painting by Rembrandt, and we're reading Henry Nouwen's book of the same title. And I think this is a perfect story to ponder during this season of Lent. One of the key thoughts, as I've mentioned, is coming home. And what he wrote in the book is, coming home meant for me walking steps by step towards the one who awaits me with open arms and wants to hold me in an eternal embrace. And in many ways, I believe Nouwen speaks for us all. And perhaps this time together will draw us closer to God and closer to one another. So with that, I invite us to share our call to worship. If you have our worship guide, study guide, you'll have that. And we'll have these on the screen for us as well. Those who go out weeping shall come home with shouts of joy. Those who worry about their life shall learn that God knows all their needs. Those who have experienced the swarming locust shall eat in plenty and be satisfied. Those who long for comfort shall be glad and rejoice, for God has done great things. I invite Lee Young now to lead us in a time of song and hymn this evening.
I invite you to join in singing. The words will be on your screen. There is a wideness in God's mercy.
I want to invite you to share in our responsive reading tonight as well, Psalm 126. When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. And then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then it was said among the nations, the Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we rejoiced. Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like the watercourses of the Negeb. May those who sow in tears reap with shouts of joy. Those who go out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, carrying their sheaves. And our gospel lesson for tonight, and the focus of our study, comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 5, verses 11 through 32. And this is the story that is familiar to many in the church and beyond the church as well, the story of the prodigal son. Jesus continued, there was a man who had 2 sons. The younger son said to the father, Father, give me my share of the estate. So he divided his property between them. Not long after that, the younger son got together all he had, set off for a distant country, and there squandered his wealth in wild living. After he had spent everything, there was a severe famine in the whole country, and he began to be in need. So he went and hired himself out to a citizen of that country, who sent him to his fields to feed pigs. He longed to fill his stomach with the pods that the pigs were eating, but no one gave him anything. When he came to his senses, he said, How many of your father's hired servants have food to spare? And here I am starving to death. I will set out and go back to my father and say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me like one of your hired servants. So he got up and went to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and was filled with compassion for him. He ran to his son, threw his arms around him, and kissed him. The son said to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and against you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his servants, Quick, bring the best robe and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet. Bring the fattened calf and kill it. Let's have a feast and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. So they began to celebrate. Meanwhile, the older son was in the field. When he came near the house, he heard music and dancing. So he called one of the servants and asked him what was going on. Your brother has come home, he replied, and your father has killed the fattened calf because he has him back safe and sound. The older brother became angry and refused to go in. So his father went out and pleaded with him. But he answered his father, Look, all these years I have been slaving for you and never disobeyed your orders. Yet you never gave me a young goat so I could celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours, who has squandered your property with prostitutes, comes home, you killed the fatted calf for him? My son, said the father, you are always with me, and everything I have is yours. But we had to celebrate and be glad, because this brother of yours was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found. This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. So in an attempt to help us have a conversation tonight, I want to give you just a little idea of how I want to do this study for folks who are here and those who are online. And as we get into this evening, I have a few questions prepared that I want to lift up to you, that we can talk about, that I will respond to. And as what I'll do, I'll ask the questions. I'll give a little bit of a context from the book, my own experiences, and from the painting itself, actually. And then while I'm doing that, I'll invite you to ponder the question. And then I'll come back and I'll ask the question one more time so that we can know what I'm asking. And perhaps you'll have questions and your own responses to the reading and to some of the things that I want to mention tonight. And Lee Young, who is with us, she is on Facebook now and online. And she's going to be able to share with me some of the online responses for you at home. So you, at any time you have a question or a response or want to share your thoughts, do so. And I'm going to pause after I ask the question a second time to hear those from you. So we'll see how that goes tonight. If we need to adjust next week, we will. But want to get into the book at this time. Now, the first question I want to ask us, it only seems fitting to me that if you've read the first part of this book, you know that Henry Nouwen reflected on this painting and sat with this painting for a good bit, 4 hours one day in Russia. But before that, he had considered it for a long time by seeing a poster. So it only seemed fitting that you and I just take a moment tonight and gaze on the picture ourselves, and to ponder, to see what about the picture might inspire us, and what questions I might prompt us to ask together today that might be insightful for us. But before we look at that, I want to give a little bit of a context and a background to the painting that we're going to look at together. In fact, it's on the screen now. That's great. You can begin to look at it now. But in 1983, Henry Nouwen encountered a poster of Rembrandt's painting, The Return of the Prodigal Son. And when he was asked about it, he said, "It's beautiful. It's more than beautiful. It makes me want to cry and laugh at the same time. I can't tell you what I feel as I look at it, but it touches me deeply." Now, if you recall that time that he encountered the poster, you'll remember that he was weary. And if you haven't read the book, I'll give you a little bit of background as well. But he was weary from a lot of travels and a lot of speaking engagements. And he said that he came home after those very important meetings, talking about justice and peace in the world, that he was exhausted and he felt vulnerable. And he went so far as to say that he also felt a devastating loneliness at the time that he encountered this painting. Now, if you know Nouwen, he was a very dynamic speaker, a wonderful teacher and prolific writer, but eventually he resigned from all those posts in life, and he took on a life in France to spend a career in the rest of his life helping with those who are mentally and physically handicapped. And that experience changed his life deeply as well. And he thinks and he speculates in this book that because of the way he was feeling and leaving a rather public life that had drained him, that was rewarding and lucrative in many ways and made him quite famous, now he was taking on a vocation that was far more humble and quite frankly asked some harder things of him. And he began to relate to the younger son in the painting. And I think that's helpful to know as we look upon it, because he really zeroed in on the youngest son initially. And if you recall the story in Russia, it's a little bit of a funny story, so please do read that. But as he gazed on the painting, he considered all these changes in his life, and here's what he wrote. "In my innermost being, I became more and more of part of the story that Jesus once told and Rembrandt once painted." So with that background, if I understand Nouwen correctly, he spent 4 hours gazing on this painting in Russia. We're going to spend about that much time together over the next few weeks. But I want to ask you to spend 3-4 minutes tops and ponder and look at this painting. What do you see in this painting that inspires you? Maybe you want to reflect on the way light is used. Maybe there's a character in the story that you want to focus on. But this is a form of meditation, a form of prayer even. So invite the Holy Spirit to speak with you and through you as we gaze upon this painting together. In just a moment, I'll break that silence for us, and I'll share a little bit about what I see and hope to hear from you too, both here and online, what you see and how you experience this painting. So with that, let's observe 3 or 4 minutes now as we look at the painting. Break our silence for a moment and share one thing that grabs my attention every time I look at this painting. And one of those is the way that for which it's set up this way. Here we go. Point this way. One of the things that I notice when you stand in front of this painting is there's this empty space at the very bottom of it. There's almost a circle of people. You see the son leaning into the father's chest and his stomach, and you see the people behind him circled around at various depths. But it's almost as if the one who is looking at the painting is in the painting itself. That you're kind of in that room, you're part of that circle. And it makes me focus in on that child, or that young man rather, that everyone else is looking at. And a couple other things I want to share too. I want to pause. What are some things that you all see that strike you as important or that maybe inspire you as well? Anything online? Okay.
Not yet.
All right. Any other thoughts? Yeah, who are the other people? Yeah, it's almost like you step in a room of who are you in this? It's not clear, though, is it, about who folks are? Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, the lack of color that's in the son's clothing. He looks different. He stands out, doesn't he? He very much stands out in this picture. You have to almost look at him.
Yeah. Well, and the fact that he has one bare foot,
Yeah.
but the other foot has part of a sandal kind of still there, so it's so disheveled.
Yeah, the idea of if we see someone walking around with one shoe on and one shoe off, we know something's not quite, something's wrong even, there isn't there? It's not natural. Later on in the book, he talks about that there's almost this image of weakness and strength, that one foot is protected and the other foot is not. And it makes me even ponder the other places where Jesus took sandals off to wash them. I think of Moses taking his sandal off and standing on holy ground. So maybe it's even meant to call us into, this is holy ground here that we're looking at too.
So Sandra Dickinson says, can you hear me? Okay. Says she notices the father's hands. One looks almost like a mother, and the other one is stronger like a father.
Yeah, one of the comments we have is, if you look at the father's hand, one of them looks like a father and one of them looks like a mother. And when you read ahead now and points that out as well, that there's this firmness to his hands, which makes me kind of want to share one of the other insights that I see. When I see the hands, there's almost this sense he's holding him down, as if the son might want to stand up and flee even. That he's holding him, but not forcing him, but there's this firmness to him holding on to him as well. Yeah, that's wonderful.
Okay, and we have two more comments. Kim, your wife, says he looks exhausted and yet at peace.
Yeah, he looks exhausted, yet at peace.
And Becky Sargent says, I find I can identify with each of those figures at different times in my life.
Becky Sargent shares that she can identify with each of those figures at different times in her life. And Becky, we're going to come back to that in just a moment as well, because that's one of the things I want to invite us to do is who are you in this painting? Where do you find yourself in this painting? And I want to piggyback too off that, the state of the son. Quite frankly, he's hard for me to look at because he looks malnourished almost. It's painful. He's in a painful state, which makes me kind of want to turn my head, but deep down I know I need to keep looking because he's the brightest image. He's the brightest part of the painting. In his disheveled state, you can tell he is the center of attention in this crowd. He is the one to look at, but he's also both the hardest to look at, but also the most important to look at. Any other thoughts? Great insight there. The back three in the background are kind of leaning in, aren't they? But at different depths, right? Everybody's at kind of they're paying attention, but they're at a different place of being engaged in it. And we're going to come back to that in a moment, but he talks about this sense of being engaged in our spiritual life or observing it. And that's what we're going to talk about next, is what's the difference between observing and participating in our spiritual journey. But that's definitely what it seems that Rembrandt wants us to see. And based on Rembrandt's life, Rembrandt had lived a bit of a younger son kind of lifestyle early on in his own life. And later on he began to see, and I think he talks about in the book that the fact that Rembrandt really began to paint faces of those who were older in life. So this was also, as he aged, this was the last painting most likely that he ever did. And so these are always, not all of his paintings, but many of his paintings seem to be self-portraits that said more about the physical look, but the spiritual state of his living as well. Any other comments, Lee?
No.
Okay. So I want to kind of move the conversation from that into this idea and this difference of participating and observing in our spiritual life. I've invited us to observe this painting as if there's something to learn on the outside looking in. I've also indicated that there's kind of a nature to this story that says we're also participating in this. You've already expressed that you find yourself in the painting. I think the painting is set up in such a way that you're kind of inserted into the painting. So what's the difference between observing and observing in our spiritual life? And here's the question I'm going to come back to in a moment. I want you to imagine that you're the youngest person in the story. I want you to imagine you're the young son in the story. And what thoughts might you have about those on the outside looking into you? What thoughts do you have as the younger son about those who are looking in on you? And we'll come back to that. But one of the key things that Nouwen talks about in the story is that he felt like an observer in his spiritual journey and not a participant. Now, he had spent his whole life teaching people how to be participants in their spiritual journey. He had seen the fruits of that. He was world-renowned for that kind of effort. If you've read his books, he was a formative voice in my own spiritual journey. But what I didn't realize, he did not feel like he had engaged his own spiritual journey. He had been an observer of others, he thought. On page 23 in the book, he talks about this as stepping into the light and stepping into the light of spiritual formation. And he says, it is the place of light, the place of truth, the place of love. It is the place where I so much want to be, but am so fearful of being. It's the place where I will receive all I desire, all that I ever hoped for, all that I will ever need. But it is also the place where I have to let go of all I most want to hold on to. It is the place that confronts me with the fact that truly accepting love, forgiveness, and healing is often much harder than giving it. It is the place beyond earning, deserving, and rewarding. It's the place of surrender and complete trust. Now, that idea of it being, that receiving healing is much harder than giving it, is something I hear that myself say, and I've heard many of us say over the years. It's easier to give forgiveness than to receive it. It's easier to give love than to receive it. And I think that speaks to our experience. But I think he's also speaking to the notion that it's easier to encourage others to be spiritual and to take a spiritual journey than to actually take it ourselves. And we know that experience God. We can know that experience God love and grace and mercy, and we can know that's there waiting for us. But we still hesitate to step into the light of that. And it reminds me of the person in the painting, if you can see them. In fact, there's another person that I can't see very well. As you mentioned earlier, everybody's at a different distance, and depending on how close you are to the sun is how bright your face is lit up. And Nouwen saw these as observers, and some of them were farther away than others. So he began to kind of see himself as that person off in the background too, not drawing close enough to experience what's happening in the middle of that painting. And he asked himself, had I myself ever dared to step into the center, kneeling down and letting myself be held by a forgiving God? Now, the question I asked you earlier is to imagine yourself as the young son in this story, the one leaning into the Father. And I want you to think about, what is it like to know that people are looking in on you in this painting? And I want to share a couple of things as you think about your response to that. But my first feeling, if I imagine myself as that son in that painting, it's embarrassing. The idea that I would be in such a vulnerable place and people are looking in on me, that would be terrifying. And so when I see his face buried into his chest, I'm almost thinking, yeah, that's exactly where my face would be, because that way I couldn't see everybody that I know is looking at me right now. And I'm also thinking in that moment that I'm glad the Father came to me. If you remember, the Father ran out to him and grabbed him before anybody else could show up. Because if somebody had gotten there before God, I might have turned around and run the other way. But then that's where the hands in this painting come in and say, okay, God met me before I could flee here. So I got a couple other responses, but what are some responses that you all have as being the younger son? What's it like to be him in this painting for you? And any responses online yet? Okay. What are the feelings he has, you think? What would you have in that moment? Shame and what? Shame and self-awareness. Yeah. He had a lot to be ashamed of, right? And everyone around him knew. He had a lot to be ashamed of. I bet somebody was thinking, he ought to bury his head in this chest. He had been a pretty bad dude. Pardon? But he's still at home. I'm still here. Even in that shaming or shame, I'm still here. And he leans into that, doesn't he? It takes guts to go home. Yeah.
Jane Cannon says that she would feel thankful that I found my way home.
Thankful. So, very thankful that he found his way home. Yeah. I said earlier that when I saw that, there's a sense that he might want to run away. I bet he still felt that too. And I bet those hands were saying, no, don't run away. Almost, when I see that painting, I think about, he may have been leaning out every so often to say, no, stay right here. Stay right here. What are the feelings? Do you think he felt like people around him were better than him? Yeah. Paul's comparing the older son, which is most likely the older son, standing there off to his right, very much like the person in the temple who was so guilty feeling that he couldn't even look up around him. So this could easily be that parable, couldn't it? It could easily be that parable. And instead of a place to kneel and pray, he's leaning to the Father. But it's the very same story. The very same story, yeah.
Becky says, courage to face family after failure.
He had a lot of courage in this too. The courage to find your way back home and do those things. I want to offer that all the things that we've said, they're all right. I mean, how many times in life do we kind of come across these moments where we feel 1,000 things all at once? And it's natural to feel that way. So I have a feeling that's what he's feeling here in this story. He's feeling all of those things, and probably things that we can't even get word to as well.
Also a comment, he may have wondered what they were going to say about him.
What are they going to say about me when I look up here? What are they going to say about me? Carry that thought into another question for us. And I want to focus a little bit on what Nowan talked about, becoming God's home. And the question I'm going to come back to, that I want to ask now, is what do you think it means to make ourselves God's home? What do you think it means to make ourselves God's home? Now on page 24, Nowan writes this: I knew that I would never be able to live the great commandments to love without allowing myself to be loved without condition or prerequisites. He later said that he's still on my way home, but ready to share the story with us. I think that's key to understanding this story. Nowan didn't write this story as a conclusion, as if he had made it. He wrote this story in the middle of a journey on the way. And I think what he's getting at here is that we must still be willing to allow God to live within us And that's what he's calling God's home. And also recognize that God is pursuing us. We have to make room for God. If you're with us last month, Henry Nouwen talked about we need to make space in our life that's only for God. And that a lot of times we fill that space in our lives that we've made and we put something else in there. And we need to keep that room clean because that's where God lives. And we can clutter that. And when we make room, then God finds a home in us. And Jesus talked about temples, and he talked about, and he said the temple is going to come down, and 3 days later we're going to raise it back up. He wasn't talking about the real temple, right? He was talking about God living within us and making a home with us. I want to share a story. Very early in my ministry, when I was just beginning to consider a call to ordain ministry, I was given by my mentor, my first mentor, a list of the traditional historical questions that every Methodist pastor must answer affirmative to before the bishop laid hand on me and ordained me. And this was probably, I think, 6 years before that ever happened. And so I'm reading through that whole list of things about my indebtedness and my willingness to work hard and to be present. And then I came across a question that says this: are you moving on to perfection? And I remember it stopped me because I went, wait a minute. I've got to be able to say this before I'm ordained? And I picked that list of questions up. I went to my mentor and I set this down. I said, we need to talk because I don't think I'm going to ever be able to say yes to this. I have to be perfect before I'm ordained. Is that really what this is saying? I really thought that's what it meant. And he smiled at me, and Paul smiled a little bit too, because this is one of those questions that makes me pause, and it ought to. But as we talked about it, what I began to understand is grammar is important. You have to read the question and what it's saying. It says, are you moving on to? Are you going somewhere, in other words, that you're not at yet? And it's meant to remind us, as Matthew 5:48 says, be perfect as God is perfect. Now, what Matthew is trying to say to us is grow in your faith. Be mature in your faith. Don't get stuck. Don't think you've arrived. And if it's God's love that's guiding you, then what are you moving towards? You're not moving towards anything less than God's perfect love. We can love someone perfectly ever so often, maybe. We might experience an unconditional, free love of somebody. And then we can lose that, right? But the point is, God doesn't lose that ability for us. In other words, I share that story because growing in love happens when God's grace makes room and lives into that room in our lives. That perfect love. And that's how God finds a home in us. So what are your thoughts? What do you think it means to make yourself a home for God? How do we do that? There's a place, as you think about that, in Louisville. I think it's 4th Street. And there's a plaque up. And it was Thomas Merton who was in that spot in Louisville. And I don't have the quote with me right now, but essentially what Thomas Merton felt in that moment, he looked around. He saw everyone in his vicinity. And he felt like he could love them perfectly. He experienced this moment of, I love everyone in this space. And it was a moment of him where he felt this Methodist idea of perfecting grace. And I think we have that capability in letting God live within us to teach us and help us experience what that is. So if you're ever in Louisville, it's a great place to go visit and to ponder, as all these people might be around you, that we can love people perfectly and fully. We might lose it, but it's there for us. Any questions or responses? Yeah, Paul is saying that God can move into our lives unexpectedly, and we need to be open to that. And as I think about what Merton was trying to say, Merton was not saying, I love them, but that love happened to him. Oh my, I just felt the depth to which God loves me and loves everyone in this area here. So let's look back at this painting for a moment. And we kind of see that in the Father, right? We see someone who has every reason in the world not to love that younger son. But he made a big deal out of loving that son, to a point of almost to be embarrassing, right? In this story, I think one of this idea that what the Father does, it really is embarrassing. This wasn't proper etiquette. And so he kind of becomes an embarrassment, but for the sake of welcoming his son into a presence. Okay, son, I'm going to share in your embarrassment. I'm going to make a scene too, but I'm going to make it on the side of love. One more question I want us to think about and to talk about before we finish tonight. And you've alluded to this, is all these characters, all these images in the painting. As we continue to read the book, as we continue to talk about this together, what do you anticipate you might learn from this painting, from this story of the prodigal son, from the life of Henry Nouwen? What is it that you anticipate that you might learn, or maybe even need to learn during this season of Lent? Now, he makes the point, Nouwen does in the book, that he thinks that we are never only the young son, and we're never only the older son. He thinks that we're both sons in many ways, maybe not all the time, but at different times, maybe at the same time. But by the end of the book, in the end of our conversation, the goal is to become like the Father. And I love one of the illustrations he talks about in the book. He reminds us that before any of us are ever mothers or fathers, we were first daughters and sons. We were always the sons or daughters first. And then we became, in maturing, the mothers and fathers. I think that's a helpful image to hold on to and to think about. On page 36, he wrote, "And for you who will make the spiritual journey with me," and the spiritual journey is us reading this book with him, "I hope and pray that you too will discover within yourself not only the lost children of God, but also the compassionate mother and father that is God." So during this Lenten season, and as we dig deeper into who the son is, who the young son is, who the older son is, and who the father is, what do you anticipate we might learn together through this time? What are some thoughts you have? Which one are you most interested in, and why?
I think every artist paints his own life. And as I look at this picture, I ask, what of this was in Rembrandt that would make him paint this? So that's something that I think is worthy of our search.
Yeah, looking at someone else's face story. Excuse me, for those who couldn't hear, I think Paul was alluding to the fact that there is a purpose for Rembrandt painting this, that it tells us something about who he is and his state, and his spiritual state even. And we're invited into that, which, Paul, that's a very vulnerable thing to do, right? If you think about his courage to, and if you look at some of his earlier paintings, he was always kind of the young son. And now he's something way different than that. And he's letting us see that. So there's almost this invitation to, okay, look at me. Who else did that at the resurrection? What did Jesus do? Let me show you my scars. Look, this is me. And Rembrandt is having the courage to do that. So maybe courage is one of the things we can really focus on over these next few weeks. Yeah. Any other thoughts?
I think when we think about the story and we see father and son, we very easily can relate. Of course, he has unconditional love for his son, because if we are mothers or fathers, we feel that for our children. But it's not just a family. Like, I have unconditional love for my daughter, obviously. Do I have unconditional love for everybody else's daughter?
It's harder, isn't it?
That's a lot harder. So I think sometimes we just get stuck in that father-son and not that everybody is the son.
So maybe that challenge for us is, okay, how, God, can you show me to love that daughter or son the way that you love me, or that I love those who are maybe not easy to love, but who are natural. There's sometimes in our faith we talk about it being natural to love. It doesn't come natural to us. We struggle with that. We have to work at it. We have to kind of work against what we are sometimes, right? And it's a constant work. And I think that gets back to now as we take this journey together. I share this not as one who's finished this course, but on the way with me. We're all going home, in other words. Yeah. I want to focus on the older son, and I think, Lee, for some of the reasons that you mentioned, I think the older son, reading about him, we know what it means. We know how to be the good son, right? It's not so hard to understand the good son. And being the good son, this older son had done good things. He had been upstanding his whole life, it seems. He was good. But boy, there is a fine line between being good and being better than, right? It's easy to become or think that we're better than. And I wonder, around that circle, it would have been easy to feel, well, I'm better than, back in the temple, the righteous person who comes to the temple, oh, God, thank goodness I'm not like this sinner over here. The hard part of that story is he's right. I'm glad I'm not like him. But the part he misses is he's essentially saying, I'm glad I'm better than him. It's a whole different way to look at that story. And I think that we see that on full display in this story. Jesus tells that parable in the Corinthians. He says the same thing. Yeah, go ahead.
Or why is he good?
Why is he good?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is he good because he just does everything he's supposed to do?
Mm-hmm.
Or is he good because he loves the Father and he wants to worship the Father, as in Jesus? Or is he just going through the motions, this is what I'm supposed to do and I'm going to do it? Was his heart really good?
Yeah, and early on in that first chapter, that first quote that I read, Nowen said, I want to step into that light of unearned love, free love, gracious love, something I didn't earn. And in a lot of ways, my heart goes out to that older son. He could have earned love. He earned love. But it was love he already had. Son, I loved you before you did any of that good stuff. But he reinforced that earning of love by living a good life. It doesn't mean we should live like the younger son. But we have to be careful not to be better than others. And I think we can do that in subtle ways. If I'm not careful, I'm glad I didn't do that. What I really need to say is, that person needs the kind of love I understand. And that takes discipline on my part too.
Your wife said, being vulnerable in our brokenness and knowing that we are beloved.
There's a definite invitation here to be vulnerable. There's an invitation here to share with someone, to do what Rembrandt did, to do what the son is doing. And I'll ask this, do you have anyone in your life who knows you such that you can share those kind of things with them? These are not questions I'm going to force anyone to say in places like this, of course, although you may want to if it's safe for you, but at the same time, having those safe places, those people who we can make home with. And here's how I'm broken. Here's where I'm falling short. Here's what I'm struggling with. And I need support in that. And that takes a lot of vulnerability. It takes a lot of courage. And that was, if you remember, one of the reasons Nowen had a hard time stepping into that. It was hard to do. I would love to get into his life story in France. My French is non-existent, but I think it's large. And there in his work with a young man named Adam, if I correctly think, his story with Adam, I would encourage you to go and read that story sometime because the transformation that brought for him really does speak to that kind of vulnerability that he learned and who he learned it from. Corinthians says that we must not measure ourselves by one another, because when I measure myself to you or you to me, that we really don't understand. And on the opposite end of that spectrum is Philippians says, don't count others more significant than you. There's so many places in the Bible where we get this warning and guidance. Don't think yourselves better than. I bet you can think of 3 parables now that talk about that. Don't take the splinter out of someone's eye if you don't take care of the log in your own eye. It's full of those things. So we must, therefore, if it has to be written, it must be something we need to pay attention to. But at the end of the day, and at the end of this study, I think and I hope what we'll see is that we are both the older son and the younger son, and that we can become like the Father. And if we will strive to be like the Father, and if we will understand the love that the Father has for the Son in this painting that's perfect, that maybe on the other side of Lent, that we'll be able to love better in our lives. Are there any other questions that you have, or any other insights that you want to share? We all need grace. And I need loads of it in my life. And my wife, don't put a smiley face for that.
She laughed a lot.
She laughed? Yeah, there you go. There you go.
She just logged off.
What I'm going to try to do each week is give you some journal and reflecting notes as well. So in the guide I sent you, those are questions just for you. And hopefully they will enlighten you or guide you or invite you to dig into what this story means. And I'll try to send out the reading list and the questions tomorrow and each Thursday so that you'll know kind of where we're going in the next week. Next week, we're going to look a little closer at the young son in the story. The week after that, the older son. And then the next week from there, the father. And then we're going to conclude by asking ourselves again, what's it like to become the father today? And how can we do that? So with that, let me offer just a brief word of prayer. And then we're going to sing softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling together. God, during these 40 days of Lent, help us to lean into your presence. Help us to sense and to even feel what it was like for the young son in this painting to lean into the warmth and the softness of his father's clothing and hide his face from the shame and the judgments that perhaps surrounded him. Help us to feel the firm hand of the Father on our own backs. May it comfort us and hold us in place, reminding us that we have nothing to run from, only to fall to your grace and your love. Thank you for the conversations tonight, and may the Holy Spirit continue to speak through us and among us, and may we, as a result, find that you have made a home within us all. And it's in Christ's name that we pray. Amen.
As the Father welcomed the younger son home, Jesus is always calling us and welcoming us home. So I invite you to sing softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling. Softly and tenderly, Jesus is calling, calling for you and for me. See on the portals, he's waiting and watching for you.
let's share in reading our closing prayer and our benediction together and with the responsive reading that you have. Go home with hearts filled with hope, for God, who has restored us in the past, will do so again. Let us go home singing songs of hope. Go home with shouts of joy, for God, who knows our tears, will not leave us comfortless. Let us go home singing songs of joy. Go home with souls touched by grace, for God, who knows our needs and daily cares, will provide us with the blessing of life. Let us go home singing songs of grace and mercy. Go in peace. Amen.